Hello, students. What I'd like to do is introduce you to this concept called absolutism. So the third topic we're looking at is this absolutism, which is a form of government. So historically, I would argue what we're looking at is a series of absolute monarchs in this chapter. And it is still a form of government used today, but typically absolute monarchs have complete control over their government. What we're going to hope to do this unit is look at a couple examples of an absolute monarch, and we will do a project concerning one absolute monarch from a specific country. And what we're going to see with absolutism is some absolute monarchs, in addition to having complete authority over the government and the people, they also claimed to rule through what's called divine right, meaning they're especially blessed by God to rule the state. So it's kind of an extra layer to absolutism, but not all absolute monarchs believed in divine right rule. What I'd like to do next is show you a couple of pictures of absolute monarchs. Like this is Philip II of Spain. We have Queen Elizabeth here of England, knighting, I believe, Sir Francis Drake. And then we have on the left here is Louis XIV of France, and on the right we have Peter the Great of Russia. So Louis XIV of France and Peter the Great are considered to be some of the most important absolute monarchs, some of the best examples of absolutism. They rule very different states in France and Russia, but they do have complete authority over their state. Now, in this map, I want to talk about why does absolutism come about? Well, there was a war we didn't cover called the 30 Years' War, but the 30 Years' War was exceptionally devastating, probably the most devastating loss of life for the Europeans until the 20th century, World War I and World War II. But with the 30 Years' War, we have some realignment of some boundaries in Europe. And in particular, for our class, we are looking at the absolute monarchs in Spain, down here on the left, and we'll look at France with Louis XIV as an absolute monarch. We're also going to cover the Russian state. Your textbook will give you information about Brandenburg, Prussia here in green, and Austria. There's a great absolute monarch to look at in the Ottoman Empire, Suleiman. In England, we'll touch upon in a little bit different manner, but absolutism is a form of government that we're going to see spread across the European continent. And again, the best examples are typically found in Russia, France, and really the Ottoman Empire. But for our sake of surviving 10th grade, we're not going to cover all of these monarchs. When we talk about an absolute monarch having complete control over a government, I have included in your materials here a worksheet actually where you're going to be looking at, well, an absolute monarch is the head of the government, the church, the military, the legal system, and the culture. So the concept, like if we were in class, I would argue that first column on the left, like that's what the absolute monarch's in charge of. And typically I find this to be a challenge for students. And so then what you're going to do for your assignment is to think about, well, where does that power reside in the United States today? Where does the power of government reside? Is it with the president? Is it with the legislative body on the national level or the state level or the local level? Is it with the courts or other power groups? Well, we might argue the president has power because he's the president. The legislature, Congress, that's the national level. The state level is in Harrisburg. The local level is, Allegheny County, Ross Township, Westview, North Hills School Board. So there is some power legislatively to run the government. There's power of the courts and other power groups. Well, everyone over 18 has the ability to vote. So they too have a say in government. So it's interesting, in an absolute monarchy, the absolute monarch, it's a king or a queen, has complete control over the government, the church, the military, the legal system. But in our government, we divide that power up among different power groups. So I've created this chart, and your assignment due for Friday will be to kind of fill out the chart and think about our own government and what are some examples. Now, what's particularly interesting, I think, historically here is, they controlled the government. The church is pretty easy to understand, the military, the legal system. But one thing I suspect students have trouble understanding is really this last section with culture, the social system. Because we're so far from that today, but in this time period of absolute monarchs with Louis XIV and Peter the Great, they do set the tone for culture and the social structure of the family, the things they wanted, the things that sometimes they force people to do certain things. So I want you to look for that as we cover this unit really of absolutism. So I have an assignment in the classroom here for you to look at, and we talk about these functions of an absolute monarch. You want to define the terms or know the term like the president or the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. And then you're going to look for examples of how, where the power is divided in our country. And if we were sitting in school, we would discuss this more as a class. So this is what the form looks like in your classroom. And the last thing I would mention to you is we do have absolutism in our country, in the world today, not our country, excuse me, in the world today. States like Saudi Arabia and Brunei are absolute monarchies. And we certainly see this concept of absolutism not go away, but I would argue over the last 5 centuries, we see states moving away from this to some sort of democracy to an extent. We do at various times in history, though, see people try to get complete control over a state. We've seen it many times in the 20th century. And I found those leaders, I think, to be much more devastating than the leaders we'll study in the 1600s. But in the 20th century, absolute leaders or dictators, they'll have modern communication technology, which make their time period as a rule so much more devastating than it was 400 or 500 years ago.